Mr. Speaker, the armed forces' capabilities allow defence to meet a range of domestic and global commitments. Defence is reorganising and re-equipping to face future threats. However, as I have previously stated, as the threats change, we need to change with it. Any specific changes related to personnel numbers or military equipment capabilities will be determined once the update to the Defence Command paper has concluded, which I expect to happen in June.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While conscious that my right honourable friend has accepted the conclusions of last year's 1922 Defence Committee report, and also when drafting his command paper, and also conscious of the fact that there is real concern about we're about to hear about the integrated review and indeed one-off increases. What does he think it will take for this House to sustainably increase defence spending given geopolitical events?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Look, first and foremost, I think we've been sustainably increasing our defence since 2020. The Prime Minister recognises the dangerous world we're in, and that was recognised in that autumn statement where both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister recognised the importance of increasing defence spending. The Prime Minister has obviously talked over the weekend about defence spending. There will be a budget later in the week, and then I think there'll be some further discussions to have.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course, the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, said last month that, and I quote, "The planned cuts in the strength of the Army must be stopped and fresh investment must pour into our artillery, air defence, communications and logistics capability." What is the Secretary of State, who has overseen some of these cuts, now going to do to reverse and to build back the capacity that Lord Dannatt and others are calling for?
Well, I think if the honourable member had been listening, he'd know that in our Defence Command paper we were investing into air defence, electronic warfare, signals intelligence, communications, all the things he's just reeled off, but maybe he doesn't bother to listen the original thing. Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's interesting the Labour Party heckling. We haven't heard a single penny of their defence plans in the last few years. Even the Russie speak by the French bench themselves couldn't put a finger on the money. First and foremost, we are investing in our defence. We've had a record increase since 2020. It compares from the Labour Party's record that in 1997 they inherited 2.7% of GDP. It continued to fall all the way, and only at the very last minute, when they had a £36 billion black hole, did they try and rectify it.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Conscious that there's a statement to follow, could I just pause and say thank you to the Defence Secretary and his team for the tireless work they've done in trying to secure additional funding, $11 billion worth, and an increase in defence spending of 2.5%. It wasn't to be. Our military will be affected by that, not least our land forces. But I do welcome the AUKUS agreement, which will secure hundreds of highly skilled jobs up and down the country. Could I ask, of the $3 billion additional funding for the nuclear enterprise, is part of the $10 billion reserved for Dreadnought, or is it ring-fenced for the AUKUS procurement programme? And of the $5 billion that's coming through, is any of it subject to VAT, which of course means 1/5 of it will go back to the Treasury?
My right honourable friend makes an interesting point about the details of the announcement. Obviously, the details will come forward in the budget. What I can say is that the £2 billion plus of money is new money and is not part of the reserve or anything else, and is separate to the £2.3 billion for Ukraine. It also comes on top of the £560 million of extra money for weapons and restocking that was announced in the autumn statement. On the nuclear chapter, the £3 billion is a recognition of the need for increased defence capability in that space, but also the need to now invest in infrastructure, that if we didn't start now, it wouldn't be fit for purpose when AUKUS starts towards the end of the decade.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We understand from the press, and as the Honourable Member for Bournemouth has said, we anticipate an additional £5 billion for defence between now and 2025. The MOD has said that the Secretary of State is delighted with the settlement, and this represents a commitment of an upward trajectory. Given the impact of defence inflation and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what does he make of plans to reduce the size of the army to 72,500 by 2025?
Well, the reduction in the size of the army was also coupled with a record investment of £24 billion in the armed forces at the same time. It was also recognition that the most important thing is to make sure we give the men and women of our armed forces, whichever service they are in, the correct equipment at the correct time and create a 360 armed forces. There is simply no point playing a numbers game if you don't equip them properly, you don't house them properly, you don't care for them properly, and you don't deploy them properly. Now, he might want to play a numbers game. I don't want to turn our soldiers into cannon fodder.
James Gray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by saying how the whole House will be delighted to see you back in your seats. It's great news. I very much pay tribute to the Secretary of State and to the entire team for the battle they've fought for the Treasury over the last few weeks. But the £5 billion is disappointing, particularly if £3 million goes to AUKUS and £1.9 billion goes to filling up our warehouses. It actually means a cut in defence spending rather than increasing it. I was encouraged, nonetheless, by what the Secretary of State said a moment ago about the fact that budgets on Wednesday and various other remarks he made, which seemed to me to indicate there may be more money to come. Am I being over-optimistic?
Well, look, remember all departments, my honourable friend would know that all departments are currently within their current comprehensive spending review, and the next comprehensive spending review is due effectively in 18 months, 2 years' time. And therefore, while of course all departments, including defence and transport and health, suffer from inflationary pressures with the higher inflation, of course the right thing to do is to make sure we live within the envelope and where possible seek relief for a range of challenges. That's what I have been seeking in these next 2 years with the Treasury, but also I have said consistently the most important thing is the headmark for the long-term direction of defence spending, so that defence spending is no longer declining as it has done for the last 3 decades. It is on the upward trajectory. Since 2020, it has been on that upward trajectory. This grant of the extra money continues that momentum. That's incredibly important. I hope to see the headmark in detail be announced soon.
Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In November, the Defence Secretary told the Select Committee, yes, the inflationary pressure on my budget for the next 2 years is about £8 billion. From the media briefing at the weekend, we know he's got a welcome £5 billion earmarked for stockpiles and the UK's nuclear programme. But the armed forces will see this funding as a defeat for the MOD in government. There's no new money for pressures on the core defence budget, no new money to help deal with capability gaps or even to deal with that inflation. So when the National Audit Office has already said the MOD cannot afford the capabilities needed in the 2021 integrated review, how is he going to ensure that precisely the same doesn't happen again with today's 2023 integrated review?
Well, what I'm going to do, which his government failed to do, is I'm going to make sure that the Defence Command Paper reflects the budget I have. I have always been consistent that the government's ambition should match its stomach, should match the money it does. If you don't get that in tandem, what you will discover is black holes grow over the years. His government was part of that in the last time. Previous Conservative governments. I have come to this House consistently to take responsibility for what our governments have done in the past. I'll be interested to see if he will.
Well, of course, in 2010, when Labour left government, we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. That's a level that's been nowhere near matched in any of the 13 years since, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the Secretary of State is now the Conservatives' longest-serving Defence Secretary, but that means he's got a track record of his own. He's cut the Army to 76,000, with more cuts to come. He's got the Ajax armoured vehicle 6 years late, with still no in-service date. He's cut and delayed new wedge-tail sentry planes, and he's got growing doubts from allies about Britain meeting in full its NATO obligations. Now, he admitted to this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, last month, the forces have been hollowed out and underfunded with Conservative governments. So will he accept his extra defence funding today can only mean more of the same?
Madam Deputy Speaker, do you know, if people came to this House with some real, genuine honesty about track records of their governments they were part of, we might be in a better position for the armed forces. The thing that we should strive for is that the men and women of the armed forces know that their leaders their political leaders are prepared to be clear about the past mistakes and talk about the future with some honesty. Madam Deputy Speaker, the National Audit Office report made a view of the Labour Party's governing of defence. I have it here because colleagues on that side of the House often forget the department's poor financial management has led to severe funding shortfall of up to £36 billion in defence spending over the next 10 years. When the department... Well, the National Audit Office is not true, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's not true. They made it up, Madam Deputy Speaker. For example, the comment, when the department signed the contract for the aircraft carriers, it was aware the overall defence budget was unaffordable, Madam Deputy Speaker. They were party to the crime at the time, but they won't come to this House now and be honest about their role in it and the things you need to do to fix it for the future.
And we won't have interventions from people who are sitting down. There are plenty of opportunities to ask questions when you're standing up. Richard Drax.
Madam Speaker, can I say how nice to see you back in your place? Very great pleasure. Can I commend my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, and his excellent front bench team, because I know for a fact they are fighting for every single penny they can get. But as has been said, and I must agree, the £5 billion is not sufficient to ensure our core armed forces are properly equipped and prepared for, God forbid, something that we all dread as the world totters towards World War III, potentially. Would he agree with me that will perhaps ask what on earth is going through the mind of the Treasury officials?
Look, I think, in defence of my colleagues at the Treasury is trying to balance an economic situation post-COVID that means we have to make sure we cut our cloth and make sure that we return to an economic credibility that's so important for growing our tax receipts and our income. I think one of the roles I can play is to come to this House and be honest about the state of our armed forces, honest about what caused the 30 years of the challenge that both he and I experienced serving in them and what we can do to fix it. I think that's the first thing. The Defence Command Paper will make sure that we are very clear in where we're going to spend the money to make sure that the future is secure for the men and women of the armed forces.
SNP spokesman Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In terms of military personnel, what is the Secretary of State's understanding of the recruitment crisis in defence, with the Army in particular, and especially so in the Royal Regiment of Scotland? 4th Battalion, the Highlanders, satisfies almost 20% of its vacancies from the Commonwealth. Is it his assessment that this is due to the poor service accommodation, mediocre pay, lack of career opportunities or substandard equipment that's driving young Scots away from a career in the British Army?
An officer in a Scottish regiment, Madam Deputy Speaker, I remember distinctly not being allowed to go and recruit in towns or schools where SNP councillors ran those schools. I distinctly remember that the SNP were so unwelcoming to members of the armed forces, it was having a detrimental effect to recruiting. I'd be very interested if the SNP has now changed their tone. They certainly have on NATO membership. They used to, if you remember, not want to be part of NATO. They now do. But I think the other thing is, you know, I don't see the army characterised as the honourable member has just described them. If you carry on talking them down like that, no wonder people aren't that keen to join. There's been a recruitment challenge to the infantry for as long as I was serving in the army. That's many, many years, both under the Labour government and the Conservative government. What we have to do is make sure the offer is improved, which is one of the reasons we did things like wraparound childcare to reflect how people live, and it's why we're investing in both married accommodation and single accommodation.
Dave Dugan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, he says he doesn't recognise the characterisation. The characterisation is based in facts. And sticking back in reality, where Germany allocates €100 billion extra in response to Ukraine, the UK allocates an extra €5 billion. The United States is frustrated that the British Army is no longer a top-level fighting force. The RAF takes 10 years to train a pilot in combat air. Army procurement couldn't order a pizza and get it delivered on time and on budget. And the Navy barely has enough F-35s for one aircraft carrier, much less two. Isn't it the case, to the great frustration of men and women in uniform, that this Tory government over the last 13 years has created an ornamental defence force? Nice to look at, don't ask it to do very much or sustain it for very long.
OK, well, Madam Deputy Speaker, getting lessons from the SNP on procurement. I mean, Ferguson Shipyard clinging on by its fingernails. When push comes to shove, they buy their ferries from Turkey, not from Scotland, when they've got a perfectly good Clyde in which to build them. He goes on about all the issues that he thinks is wrong with the armed forces from a man who is going to campaign to break Scotland away from the United Kingdom, reduce the Scottish armed forces to a rubber dinghy, and of course just tell everyone else that it's all the fault of the English. The reality is Scotland is a proud contributor to our armed forces, has been in history and is today, and also the accommodation that the soldiers have today, the experiences they have in the equipment, is a far better equipment and experiences many of us had in the early 90s. Yes, I am. And what would be really nice if once in a while the SNP in Scotland actually did more than stand in front of ceremonial troops, got out there, helped soldiers be recruited, helped the schools talk about what's important about defence, rather than always talk it down.